Picture a building that breathes like something sick. Not metaphorically, actually breathes, its timbers swelling in the damp of a Roman autumn night and creaking as they dry, its walls exhaling a fine grit of old plaster with every gust that finds its way up the stairwell, 6 floors of packed humanity above a street that never goes quiet. Picture climbing into that breathing thing every night of your life, past the cracks you've learned to step around, past the place on the 4th floor landing where the wood has gone soft and spongy underfoot, and picture doing it anyway, because there is nowhere else for a man like you to sleep. You will lose more in this building before the year is out than you have ever owned. You do not know that yet. Tonight you only know that your legs ache, that the jar of water balanced on your shoulder is cutting a red groove into the skin there, and that somewhere above you, in the dark, something in the rafters has just ticked. A small dry sound like a knuckle cracking, and you have stopped on the stairs to listen for it to happen again. Your name is Gaius Betusius Sabinus. You're 27 years old, and you've lived your whole life within half a mile of the Subura, in this district of noise and narrow streets wedged between the Viminal and the Esquiline hills, where the tenements stand so close together that you can lean out a window and touch the plaster of the building across the alley, where the sun reaches the cobbles for perhaps 2 hours at midday, and otherwise the streets stay the colour of a bruise. It is the 4th year of the reign of the Emperor Trajan, and Rome is a city of nearly 1 million souls, and you are one of them, and almost none of those souls sleep at street level. They sleep the way you sleep, stacked, floor upon floor upon floor, in wooden and mudbrick towers thrown up faster than any man could build them safely, because safety was never the point. The point was rent. You work as a structor, a builder's labourer, a man who mixes mortar and hauls brick and holds the plumb line steady, while another man, a man who calls himself an architect and has never opened a scroll of Vitruvius in his life, decides how high is high enough. It is bitter work for you in particular, because you build the very thing you live in. You have stood on scaffolding bolted to green, unseasoned timber, and thought, this would not hold my own weight if I were sleeping instead of standing, and then gone home that evening to a building exactly like it, and slept there anyway, 6 flights up, because a room on the 6th floor of the insula of the Two Doves costs 18 sestertii a month, and a room on the ground floor, if you could ever get one, would cost you 4 times that before the landlord even finished laughing at the idea of you affording it. Let that sink into you as you climb tonight, the particular arithmetic of being poor in Rome. The building narrows as it rises, in more ways than the wood tapering toward the roof. The higher you live, the cheaper the rent, and the cheaper the rent, the worse the construction, until by the 6th floor you are paying almost nothing to sleep inside a structure that is, by any honest measure, barely a structure at all. Ground floor, shops, taverns, sometimes a wealthy family's own address, with real stone foundations and proper walls a Roman inspector might actually examine. 6th floor, scraps of the same building's ambition, patched together with whatever timber was cheapest that season, walls of wattle and daub that a strong man could put his fist through if he were angry enough, or frightened enough, or simply leaning the wrong way in his sleep. You reach your landing. Your hands have gone white at the knuckle from the weight of the jar, and you set it down slowly, controlling the last 2 inches of its descent so the clay doesn't crack against the worn threshold stone. A stone your landlord did not lay, did not choose, did not pay for. It came from whatever demolished building this contractor scavenged it from 20 years ago, when this insula went up in the space of 4 months, faster than a crop of barley, because in Rome buildings are not built, they're grown, like weeds, from investment and haste, and the certain knowledge that if this one falls down, another will be built on the ashes within the season, and someone will make money on that too. Tonight the sound comes again, that dry tick from somewhere in the wall beside your door, or perhaps the ceiling, or perhaps 3 feet to your left where a crack has been widening since the spring. A crack you have watched grow the way another man might watch a wound. You press your palm flat against the plaster and feel nothing move. You tell yourself it is only the wood cooling after the heat of the day, releasing itself into the night air. Wood does that. All wood does that. And you have told yourself this same lie perhaps 40 times in the last 6 months, and 40 times you've almost believed it. This is the story of the year that lie stopped working. It begins in ordinary discomfort, hauling water, patching plaster, the small daily insults of poverty in the greatest city in the world, and it does not end that way. Before the year is finished, you will understand exactly why the men who build tenements for profit in this city do not live in them, and why the ones who do live in them learn to listen, always, for a particular kind of silence that comes just before a particular kind of sound. But that is later. Right now, it is only autumn, and you are tired, and the jar of water needs to go inside before the night chill turns the last of your washing water to ice at the rim. You push the door. It does not have a lock worth the name, only a wooden bar you drop across 2 iron brackets, because there is nothing in this room worth the thief's trouble except the people in it, and the smell meets you before anything else does, the way it always does, the way smell always arrives first in a place like this. Wood smoke, thin and bitter, from the brazier your wife Prima keeps burning low through the cold months. Beneath that, the sour reek of the cesspit 3 floors down, rising up the stairwell shaft on nights when the wind comes from the wrong direction, mixing with the tang of hot oil from someone's evening meal 2 doors along, and under all of it, always, the wet earth smell of mudbrick that has never quite finished drying in 20 years, because mudbrick never finishes drying in a room where 5 people breathe and cook and sweat inside a space no bigger than a wealthy man's dining couch. Prima looks up from the brazier where she's coaxing a meagre fire around a pot of barley porridge, and there is a question in her face before she even opens her mouth. Not fear yet, not tonight, only the tired vigilance of a woman who has learned, the same as you, to read the building the way sailors read weather. "Did it move again?" she says. Not quite a question. Her hand still working the wooden spoon, not looking up from the pot, because in a room this size there is no room to stop working just to have a conversation. Every motion has to serve 2 purposes, or there is no time in the day for it at all. Only sound, you say, no movement. You set the jar down against the wall, in the corner, where it will not be an obstacle for your daughter Marcella, who is 3 years old and low enough to the ground that she does not yet understand why the adults in her life go so quiet sometimes, so suddenly, mid-sentence, listening. You do not tell Prima that the sound came from directly above your sleeping place, rather than from the outer wall where it usually does. Some truths are better rationed out slowly, the way you ration the oil for the lamp. Tonight you will lie down in the 4 square feet of floor allotted to your family's sleeping mats, on the 6th floor of a 7-story building that was only ever supposed to be 6, and you will listen to Rome breathe around you in the dark. The murmur of 100 other families through walls thinner than a good bath towel. Someone coughing 2 rooms over, a baby crying on the floor below, the eternal creak of timber settling under a weight it was never properly measured to bear. And you will fall asleep anyway, because a man cannot stay awake every night of his life waiting for a building to decide something. Even in Rome, even here, let the smell of wood smoke settle into you as it settles into Gaius, into the very fabric of his clothes and the walls of his single rented room. That smell will matter later. Remember it. The insula where Gaius lives has a name, though no one who lives in it ever uses it except when giving directions to a stranger. The way you might name a street you walk every day without ever once looking up at its signpost. It is called the Insula of the Two Doves, after a pair of stone birds carved above the main archway on the ground floor, a decorative flourish added by whoever built this place a generation ago to make it look, from the street, like the sort of building respectable people might choose to live in. From the street, at eye level, the ground floor does look respectable enough. A row of shop fronts, a bakery whose ovens Gaius can smell on baking days even 6 floors up if the wind is right, a wine cellar, a cobbler, each with rooms above them that house the shopkeepers' own families in modest but genuine comfort. Real stone in the lower courses, real timber joists sized the way a careful builder would size them. It is only once you cross the threshold and start to climb that the building tells you the truth about itself. The stairs narrow with each flight, the treads growing shallower, the rises taller, as though whoever built this place resented every additional foot of height he was forced to provide, and began cutting corners exactly where the corners would be least visible to an inspector standing in the street below, craning his neck upward. By the 4th floor the stairs are bare wood, worn smooth and slightly bowed in the middle from decades of feet. No plaster to hide the joints, no handrail on the side that faces the open shaft down the centre of the stairwell. A fall down that shaft would take you all the way to the ground floor, and it has happened before, twice in Gaius's memory, both times to old men whose legs failed them on a dark night with a bad lamp. By the 6th floor, where Gaius's family lives, the building has stopped pretending. The walls are opus craticium, a timber lattice frame, a crude skeleton of thin wooden studs, packed between with wattle and mud in the manner of the poorest rural huts, plastered over just enough to hide the weave beneath, but never quite enough to hide it entirely, so that if you press your thumb hard enough into the wall beside your sleeping mat, you can feel the give of the wattle underneath, the springiness of sticks bound with cord. A wall that a determined child could probably put a fist through given enough motivation and enough afternoons of trying. It is the same building technique Vitruvius himself, writing in the time of the divine Augustus, condemned outright as fit only for temporary structures. Cheap, yes. Quick to erect, yes. But a technique that catches fire, he wrote, as if it had been made with the purpose, and that rots and warps and sags in ways that stone and fired brick never do. And yet here it is, a full 70 years after Vitruvius put ink to that warning, still holding up the 6th floor of a building where children sleep. Above Gaius's floor there is a 7th, though it should not exist at all. You may not know this yet, walking these stairs each night with your aching legs and your water jar. But the Emperor Augustus, more than a century ago, set the height of insulae in Rome at 70 feet, precisely because buildings kept rising higher than their foundations or their materials could safely bear, and men kept dying under the collapse weight of other men's ambition. After the great fire that burned through Rome for 6 days and 7 nights in the reign of Nero, a catastrophe that gutted 10 of the city's 14 districts and left thousands without any home at all, the height limit was cut further, down to 60 feet, and new rules demanded wider streets between buildings, porticos to shield against falling debris, water kept ready on every floor, walls of fired brick or stone in place of timber wherever it could be managed. These were good laws. They were, on parchment, exactly the laws that might have kept Gaius's building's 7th floor from ever being built. But laws written on parchment in the emperor's name do not climb 6 flights of stairs to measure a beam. The aediles who are supposed to enforce building codes are few, overworked, and easily persuaded by a purse of coin to overlook what an honest inspection would condemn. The landlord of the insula of the Two Doves, a freedman grown wealthy on exactly this kind of arithmetic, a man named Marcus Oppius Sela, who has never once, in Gaius's 4 years of tenancy, climbed higher than the 2nd floor himself, added that 7th story 11 years ago in timber and daub thinner even than the walls below it, without a permit worth the wax it was never sealed with, and rented it out within a week to a family of freedmen glassworkers who could not afford anywhere better, and who have lived above Gaius's head every night since, adding their own weight, their own braziers, their own small fires, to a structure that was never supposed to bear any of it at all. This is the sound Gaius hears at night. Not ghosts, not settling wood exactly, though that is the story he tells himself, and the story he tells Prima. It is a building carrying weight it was never designed to carry, in materials chosen for how cheaply and quickly they could be assembled rather than for how long they might last, owned by a man who will never sleep beneath that 7th floor himself, and inspected by no one at all. Something has to give eventually in a place like that. It always does. The only question, in the autumn when this story begins, is when. Morning in the Subura arrives the same way it always does, as noise before it arrives as light. Gaius wakes to the racket of handcarts on the cobbles below, iron-rimmed wheels grinding against stone, a cart driver cursing a mule that has decided, in the manner of mules, that this particular morning is not the morning it intends to move. Bakers are already shouting the price of bread 2 streets over. Somewhere a dog is barking itself hoarse at nothing. The light through the single small window, no glass, only a wooden shutter Gaius props open with a stick each morning and closes each night against the cold, is thin and grey, filtered through the shadow of the building opposite, which stands so close that if both buildings lean toward each other even slightly, they would meet in the middle of the alley. A canyon of brick and timber, 6 stories deep with a strip of actual sky, visible only if you cranked your neck straight up. Prima is already awake, already dressed, already folding the sleeping mats against the wall to reclaim the floor space for the day's living, because a room 9 feet by 12 holds no luxury of separate purposes. It is bedroom and kitchen and workshop and nursery all at once, and every object in it must be able to become something else the moment it is not being the first thing. The water jar from last night stands half empty by the wall. Marcella is awake too, sitting cross-legged on the swept dirt of the floor. There is no proper flooring up here, only packed earth over the timber joists, laid down cheap and never replaced. Turning over a wooden toy horse that Gaius carved for her out of a scrap of construction timber he was not, strictly speaking, supposed to take home from the work site. There is no kitchen in the Roman sense, no oven, no hearth built into the structure of the room. Cooking happens over a small clay brazier, a portable fire pot that Prima feeds with charcoal a few coals at a time, because charcoal must be bought, and coin is thin, and because too large a fire in a room built of timber lattice and dried mud is its own kind of danger that every tenant in this building understands without ever quite discussing aloud. You do not build a real fire in a room like this. You coax a small fire and you feed it constantly, and you never ever leave it unattended, and you keep a jar of water within arm's reach at all times, not for drinking, but for the other purpose, the purpose no one names because naming it invites it. 6 floors below and hundreds of years as privilege away, in the great houses along the lower slopes of the Esquiline and the Palatine, wealthy Romans wake in rooms warmed by Hipparchos systems that channel heated air beneath marble floors, rooms with real windows glazed in Alexandrian glass, courtyards open to the sky where fountains run cool and constant from lead pipes fed by the city's aqueducts. A domus like that might have running water in 3 or 4 rooms, might have its own private baths, might occupy more floor space for one family than this entire insular floor occupies for 6. Gaius has seen those houses. Everyone in the Subura has seen these houses, has walked past their blank street-facing walls. Wealthy Romans keep their beauty turned inward, toward private gardens, and present the poor only a windowless facade of stone, and has understood, without needing it explained, exactly how far apart these 2 Romes actually stand from each other, though they occupy the same 7 hills, breathe the same smoke, are governed by the same emperor. There is no plumbing above the ground floor in Gaius's building, none at all. Not even in the wealthier apartments a floor or 2 up where the rent climbs steeply and the ceilings are higher and the walls are proper fired brick instead of timber lattice. Every drop of water Gaius's family uses, for cooking, for washing, for the porridge Prima is stirring now, has been carried up 6 flights of stairs in a clay jar that weighs, full nearly as much as Marcella does, carried by Gaius or by Prima or, increasingly as she grows stronger, by both of them together, from a public fountain 3 streets away where the queue at dawn can stretch 40 deep, with servants from wealthier households' wives and the elderly of the Subura all waiting their turn at a trickle of aqueduct water that the whole neighbourhood depends on and none of them owns. This is the labour that never appears in any accounting of Roman life, the labour of water. A full jar carried up 6 flights leaves your shoulders raw where the strap crosses them, leaves your forearms burning, leaves you setting the jar down every second landing, not because you want to, but because your grip has started to shake, and a dropped jar on these stairs means water wasted, coin wasted, and possibly a badly cut foot from the shattered clay. Gaius does this twice a day, sometimes 3 times in the hottest months, and every single time, at every single landing, he passes cracks in the plaster that were not there last year, sags in the floorboards that were not there last spring, small signs. The building leaves like a man leaves symptoms of an illness he has not yet admitted to himself he is dying of. There is a particular indignity to needing something as basic as water, as badly as this, from a landlord who does nothing to provide it. Marcus Oppius Sila collects 18 sestertii a month from Gaius for this room, and provides, in exchange, exactly nothing. No repairs, no water, no maintenance beyond the barest patch job applied only when a crack threatens to become a hole, large enough for a body to fall through. And Sila's agent, a freedman named Neighbour with cold eyes and colder manners, cannot avoid noticing it on his monthly rounds to collect the rent. Ask Neighbour for a repair beyond that bare minimum, and he will look at you the way a man looks at an insect that has had the temerity to speak, and remind you, without ever quite saying it outright, that there are a dozen families waiting in the street below who would take your room and your inconvenient complaints off your hands for the exact same rent, so perhaps you would prefer to keep your mouth shut and your coin ready on the first of the month. Gaius has asked twice about the crack near his sleeping mat. Twice Naba has looked at it, sniffed, and said the same thing. It is only the plaster. The timber beneath is sound. The master has better things to spend his money on than an anxious tenant's imagination. Gaius does not believe this. Gaius, who mixes mortar and hangs plumb lines for a living, who has learned over 4 years of construction work exactly what a healthy wall feels like under a testing thumb, and exactly what a failing one feels like, does not believe this even slightly. But Gaius is also a man who needs a roof over his daughter's head tonight, and the calculation every tenant in this city makes, every single day, is the same one. Better a crack you know than a street you don't. Prima ladles the porridge into 2 wooden bowls, a smaller portion for herself, though she would never say so, simply serving herself last and thinnest, the way mothers in buildings like this have always done. And Gaius eats standing, because sitting takes up floor space they do not have to spare this morning, and because he is due at the work site before the sun clears the roofline of the building across the alley, which in a canyon this narrow does not happen until the morning is nearly half spent. "Tell me if it does anything today," Prima says, not looking up, meaning the crack, meaning the building, meaning all of it. She does not need to be more specific. 4 years of marriage and 2 years of watching this particular building age around them have given the two of them a whole private language built from unfinished sentences. "I'll tell you," Gaius says, and picks up his tools and goes down the 6 flights he will climb again this evening, past the crack, past the soft board on the 4th floor landing, past the missing handrail over the open shaft, out into the Subura's morning noise, to spend his day building another version of the exact building he has just left. Something is going to give. Not today. But the building has already started counting down, and none of you inside it know the number. The work site where Gaius spends his days lies less than a 1/4 mile from his own building, on a street where an older insula burned 3 years ago. A kitchen fire on the 2nd floor that spread up through an internal stairwell built, like every stairwell in every cheap insula in Rome, entirely of timber, no stone, no fireproofing, nothing to stop flame from climbing floor to floor the way it climbs a torch. 17 people died in that fire, mostly on the upper stories, mostly because the only way down was the same wooden staircase the fire had already claimed for itself, and mostly because by the time anyone in the street below noticed the smoke, the vigils, the night watch, the closest thing Rome has to firefighters, 7 cohorts of freedmen organised under Augustus specifically because fires like this one kept happening, were still 3 streets away, hauling their water pumps and their vinegar-soaked blankets and their long-hooked poles for tearing down burning timber before it could spread, arriving in time to save the buildings on either side, but not the one already consumed. The lot has stood empty for 3 years, weeds pushing up through cracked foundation stone, because the owner and his creditors have spent that time arguing in the courts over who is liable for what. And now, finally, someone has bought the scorched ground cheap and intends to build again, faster and cheaper than before, because that is always, always the answer in Rome to the question of what to do with a plot where people have recently died. Build again, rent it out. The city needs housing more than it needs mourning, and the man financing this new insula, a different investor from Kerala, but cut from precisely the same cloth, has made it very clear to the crew, through the foreman, that speed is the only thing that matters, that every week of construction is a week of rent not collected, and that corners may be cut wherever a building inspector is unlikely to look closely. Gaius mixes mortar all morning, a lime and sand mixture that should, by any honest standard, be given weeks to cure properly between courses, and is instead given days, sometimes only overnight, because the foreman has a schedule to keep, and the schedule does not bend for chemistry. He watches the carpenters set floor joists that are, by his own rough measure against the length of his forearm, noticeably thinner than the joists holding up his own building's lower floors. Cheaper timber, greener wood, cut from whatever lot the timber merchant had available, rather than whatever the structure actually required. He watches a bricklayer construct an interior wall using unfired mudbrick instead of the fired brick specified, because unfired brick costs a third as much and dries fast enough that no one examining the finished wall a month from now, once it's plastered over and painted, will ever be able to tell the difference from the street. At midday the crew breaks to eat, sitting in whatever shade the half-built structure provides, and an older mason named Vibius, a man who has worked construction in Rome for over 30 years, who has outlived 3 separate insulae he himself helped to raise, 2 of which later collapsed and 1 of which burned, tells Gaius, not for the first time, about buildings he has seen come down. Not with any particular drama in his voice. Vibius has told these stories so many times they have worn as smooth as the treads on Gaius's own stairs, the way any hard truth wears smooth with repetition until it can be spoken almost casually. You want to know the trick of it, Vibius says, working a piece of bread around a lump of hard cheese, not looking at Gaius, looking instead at the half-raised walls around them, the way another man might look at an old wound. Any fool can build a wall that stands up on the day he finishes it. Standing up is not the hard part. Standing up is not the part anyone pays you for, he chews for a moment. The hard part is standing up in 10 years, in 20, with the weight of 2 more floors added on top that nobody planned for, in a wind off the river that leans the whole building sideways an inch every time it blows hard, with the timbers drying and shrinking, and the mud in fill cracking away from the frame a little more every summer. That is the part these men, a small jerk of his chin toward the direction of the investor's townhouse, never think about, because by the time it happens they have sold the building 3 times over, and it is someone else's name on someone else's collapsed rubble. Gaius asks him quietly how many buildings he thinks come down each year in the city. Not fires, those everyone counts, everyone talks about, because fire announces itself with smoke visible for miles. Collapses are quieter. A tenement groans in the night, tips a few degrees and simply folds, floor pancaking onto floor, and unless it happens during daylight with a crowd in the street to witness it, the disaster is sometimes only ever known to the people who lived and died inside it. Vibius shrugs, an old man's shrug, weighted with more knowledge than the gesture lets on. More than they write down, more than they'd ever want a senator asking questions about at a dinner party. I have heard men joke, and it is not really a joke, that a poor man in Rome is safer in the arena facing a beast than asleep in his own bed 6 floors up. At least in the arena he knows what is coming for him. He looks at Gaius directly now for the first time in the conversation. You live high up? 6th floor, Gaius says. Insula of the 2 Doves, off the street of the tanners. Vibius makes a small sound, not quite a laugh, not quite sympathy. I know that building. I did not build it, but I know it. It went up fast, that one, back when I was younger than you. Faster than good work should go. He does not elaborate further, and Gaius does not ask him to, because some silences carry more weight than words would, and this is one of them. That night Gaius walks home slower than usual, watching the buildings on either side of the street the whole way, seeing them now with the eyes of a man who builds these things for a living rather than the eyes of a man simply hurrying home to his family. He notices, for what feels like the first time, though he must have walked past it 1,000 times before, how many of the insulae along this street lean, almost imperceptibly, toward the street, their upper floors bellying outward past the line of their foundations, the accumulated sag of unseasoned timber and unsupervised construction expressing itself in the very geometry of the buildings, a slow-motion collapse measured not in moments, but in years. He climbs his own 6 flights that evening with his eyes open in a different way than he has ever climbed them before, cataloguing every crack, every soft board, every place where the plaster has crumbled away to reveal the wattle beneath, the way Vibius taught him without ever quite meaning to teach him anything at all. Winter is still 2 months off, but something in Gaius has started counting now too, and the number he is counting toward feels closer than it did yesterday. Let that unease settle into you, into your own chest, the way it settles into Gaius's. It will not leave for the rest of this story. It is not meant to. The weeks that follow settle into a rhythm that would look, to an outsider, like ordinary life. And in a sense it is. This is what ordinary life looks like for a poor family in Rome in the 4th year of Trajan's reign, and Gaius has known no other kind. He rises before full light, eats whatever Prima has managed from the meagre stores of grain and oil their coin allows, climbs down 6 flights to the street, walks the 1/4 mile to whichever site the foreman has assigned the crew to that week, and spends the day with his hands in lime mortar until his knuckles crack and bleed in the dry autumn air. In the evening he climbs back up, past the crack that has not, in these weeks, grown any worse that he can measure, though he measures it now almost daily, pressing 2 fingers into the gap and marking with a thumbnail scratch in the plaster beside it. Exactly how far the crack has opened, a private ritual Prima has noticed, but not yet asked him to explain. Marcella grows a little each week in the way that small children do, oblivious to the architecture around her, delighted by small things. A scrap of coloured cloth a neighbour woman gives her, the particular shape of a knot in the floorboard she's taken to tracing with 1 finger, the sound of pigeons that nest somewhere in the building's eaves and coo through the thin walls at dawn. She does not know to be afraid of the crack near her sleeping mat, and Gaius has decided for now not to teach her that fear, though he has quietly begun making sure her sleeping place each night is shifted a foot farther from the wall than it used to be, an inch of margin bought at the cost of a foot of cramped floor space for the rest of them. Rent day falls on the 1st of each month, and neighbour climbs only as high as the building's own construction requires him to. He takes the stairs slowly, breathing hard by the 4th floor despite being younger than Vibius by 20 years, and arrives at each door along Gaius's corridor with a wax tablet and a stylus, and an expression that has never once, in Gaius's memory, shown anything resembling warmth. The 18 sestertii change hands without conversation most months. This month, Gaius tries again. "The wall by my sleeping mat," he says, standing in the doorway so neighbour cannot easily push past him to move on to the next tenant. "It's opened wider since the summer. I can show you." Neighbour does not look up from the tablet where he is marking the payment. "You said this before. It's worse now. Everything in this building is always worse than it was before," Naba says, and there is almost something like humour in it, dry and entirely without kindness. That is what buildings do. They age. You want it fixed, you can fix it yourself. You're a builder, aren't you? Buy your own lime, mix your own plaster, patch it on your own time. The master isn't paying good coin to repair a crack that isn't even large enough to see from the doorway. It's a load-bearing timber behind that plaster. If the timber's cracked and not just the plaster, then it isn't, neighbour says, already turning toward the next door. Because if it were, this whole floor would have come down around your ears months ago, and you'd hardly be standing here arguing with me about it, would you? He knocks on the neighbouring door without waiting for a response to that logic, which Gaius recognises, even as it infuriates him, as exactly the kind of reasoning a man uses when he has decided in advance not to spend a single sestertius on a building he does not live in and never will. Gaius goes back inside and does exactly what neighbour suggested, because there is no other option available to him. He buys a small quantity of lime on his next payday, mixes a rough plaster in a broken shard of pot, and patches the crack himself that evening by lamplight, packing the mixture into the gap with his thumb the same way he packs mortar between courses of brick at the work site. Except here there is no proper key for the plaster to grip, no clean surface beneath, only old crumbling render over wattle that flexes slightly under his pressure no matter how gently he works. The patch holds for a while. It is not a repair. It is a bandage over a wound that is still, underneath, doing whatever wounds do when no one is watching. Autumn deepens, the nights growing longer and colder, and the braziers throughout the building burn a little longer each evening as families try to keep some warmth in rooms that were never built to hold heat any more than they were built to shed it. This is the season, Gaius knows without needing to be told by anyone, when the fires start. Not maliciously, not through carelessness exactly, but through simple arithmetic. More braziers burning, more hours of the day with a flame lit somewhere in the building, more chance that some coal shifts, some scrap of cloth drifts too close, some tired mother falls asleep before banking the fire properly for the night. It happens 2 streets over, on a night in late autumn when the wind is gusting hard enough to rattle the shutters. Gaius wakes to shouting in the street below, distant at first, then closer, then unmistakable. The particular pitch of voices that means fire, a word that travels through a crowded district faster than the flames themselves ever could, because everyone in the Subura has heard that word often enough to know exactly what it demands of them. Wake, gather what you can carry and be ready to run. He goes to the window and pushes the shutter open despite the cold, and there it is. 2 streets distant, but close enough that the glow reddens the underside of the smoke drifting between the buildings. An insulae alight, flame visible now at what looks like the 3rd or 4th floor, climbing with the particular hunger of fire that has found dry old timber and cheap plaster, and does not intend to stop climbing until it runs out of floors. He can hear, even from this distance, a low roar beneath the shouting, the sound of a fire large enough to be making its own wind. Prima is awake beside him now, Marcella stirring on her mat, and for a long, terrible moment neither of them says anything, both of them doing the same silent calculation. Is it close enough to matter? Will the wind carry a spark this far? Should they wake fully and dress and be ready? The vigile's horn sounds somewhere below, that particular urgent note that means the closest cohort has been roused and is moving, hauling their pump and their axes and their hooked poles through streets too narrow for anything faster than a determined run. It's not close, Gaius says finally, though he does not entirely believe it, only believes it enough to say it aloud, the way a man says a thing to make it more true by the saying. 2 streets. The wind would have to turn twice to bring it here. They do not go back to sleep, not fully, not for hours. They sit together in the dark, with Marcella held close between them, listening to the fire's distant roar slowly diminish as the vigil's bucket chains and vinegar-soaked blankets and torn-down adjoining timbers finally choke it into submission sometime near dawn. And in the morning, walking to the worksite, Gaius passes the burned building and sees what fire does to a structure built exactly like his own. The upper 3 floors entirely gone, collapsed inward into a black tangle of charred timber and shattered brick. The ground floor shops miraculously still standing, blackened but intact, because ground floors are built of sturdier stuff and because fire, cruelly, always finds its fiercest fuel highest up, where the poorest tenants live crowded closest to the flammable roof. 6 people died in that fire, according to what the street is already saying by midday. A rumour with a number attached, which in the Subura passes for a fact until someone with more authority says otherwise. 2 of them children. The building had 1 stairwell, as Gaius's own building has 1 stairwell, and when the fire took hold of it on the 2nd floor, everyone above that floor had no way down at all except the windows, and no window on a 4th or 5th floor offers a fall a person survives. Gaius does not tell Prima the number of children. He tells her only that people died, and that the building looked like his own building might look, if the same thing happened here, and he watches something in her face close over like a shutter being latched, a decision being made behind her eyes that she does not speak aloud that morning, but that changes something in how she moves through their room for the rest of that week, checking the brazier 3 times before leaving each morning instead of once, keeping a 2nd jar of water filled and ready by the door in addition to the one for cooking, a jar whose only purpose, unspoken between them, is fire. Something in the building's rhythm has shifted after that. Neighbours who used to nod and pass in the stairwell now stop to talk, briefly, about the fire 2 streets over, about whether Seela's building has ever had an inspection, about whether anyone even knows what an inspection would look like or who would conduct it. The glassworker family on the 7th floor, the illegal floor above Gaius's own, the family whose weight and whose brazier and whose small fires have worried him for years without him ever quite articulating why, becomes for the first time a subject of open unease rather than simply an abstract pressure overhead. "They've got their own fire going near constant up there," says the neighbour across the landing. "A widow named Fusca, who takes in mending to survive and who has lived on this floor longer than Gaius has, long enough to remember when the 7th floor did not exist at all. Glasswork, you can't do it cold. I hear that little furnace of theirs going some nights past midnight." She says this the way a person says something they have decided, after long consideration they are finally willing to say aloud. I used to think nothing of it. Now I think of it every night. Let that thought settle the way it settles into Fusca, into Gaius, into every tenant on that floor who has just watched, from 2 streets away, exactly what a fire does to a building exactly like their own. The winter has not even properly begun, and already everyone in this building has started sleeping a little less deeply than they did before. Winter arrives hard that year, colder than the previous 2, and with the cold comes a new set of pressures on the building that Gaius had not fully anticipated, though perhaps he should have. Every family burns more charcoal. Every family closes its shutters tighter against the wind, trapping smoke that should escape more freely, so that by midwinter the whole stairwell carries a permanent haze of wood smoke that stings the eyes on the climb up and settles as a fine black soot on every surface it touches, on the plaster, on the underside of the roof beams, on the backs of Gaius's hands when he runs them along the stair rail out of habit. The rains come too, weeks of them. the kind of steady grey rain that turns the unpaved alleys of the Subura into channels of mud and refuse, that finds every gap in the roof tiles 6 floors above Gaius's head, and drips down through the building's frame floor by floor, soaking into timber that a proper builder would have treated against rot, and that this building's original contractor never bothered to treat at all, because treatment costs money and rot is a problem for some future owner, some future tenant, someone who is not standing in front of him now with coin in hand asking for a finished rentable building as fast as it can be thrown up. Gaius notices the water first as a faint dampness in the corner of the ceiling nearest the illegal 7th floor's fire pit. The glassworker's small furnace sits, as it happens, almost directly above the corner where Gaius's family's water jars stand, and in wet weather a persistent trickle finds its way down through some gap in the floor above, staining the mud brick a darker colour, softening the surface, leaving behind, after each rain, a fine white crust of leached lime where the water has drawn the binding minerals out of the wall itself over years of repetition. Gaius has seen this exact staining before, on old buildings condemned for demolition, on walls that no longer hold together the way a wall is meant to hold together, walls that a strong push might crumble like the crust on old bread. He mentions this to Vibius at the work site, describing the staining, the softness, the location directly beneath what he now knows is an unauthorized furnace burning most nights of the week, 6 feet above his family's heads. Vibius listens without interrupting, chewing slowly on the end of a wooden stylus he uses to mark measurements into timber, and when Gaius finishes, the old man is quiet for a long moment before he speaks. "You know what water does to unfired brick," Vibius says. "It is not a question. It softens it." "It softens it," Vibius agrees, "and softened brick does not carry weight the way dry brick carries weight, and a wall carrying weight it cannot bear does one of 2 things eventually. It bows." He holds up one hand, fingers spread, and slowly curls them inward. A small demonstration requiring no further words, or it simply lets go all at once, usually at the worst possible moment, usually in the middle of the night, because that is when the wall has had the longest stretch of hours to finally fail without anyone there to notice the warning signs first. "What would you do," Gaius asks, "if it were your wall?" Vibius looks at him for a long moment, an expression on the old man's face that Gaius has not seen there before, something almost like pity, though pity is not quite the right word for what passes between 2 men who both understand, without needing to say it, that the honest answer to that question, leave, move your family out tonight, find another building even if it costs you every coin you have saved, is not actually available to either of them. Not really. Not when there is nowhere else to go that costs 18 sestertii a month, and not when a man's savings, such as they are, amount to perhaps 60 sestertii hidden in a chipped jar behind a loose floorboard. Not nearly enough to secure a better room, even if a better room could be found on short notice in a city where every cheap room is already occupied by some other family in precisely the same bind. "I would watch it," Vibius says finally, which is not an answer so much as an admission that there is no answer, not for men like them. "I would watch it very closely, and I would make sure I always knew, day or night, exactly where the nearest way down was, and I would keep my family close to that way down, and I would pray to whatever God listens to builders, because I promise you, boy, no God listens less to any man's prayers than the God of falling buildings listens to the prayers of the men who build them." Gaius carries that answer home with him that evening, up the 6 flights, past the softened corner, past the crack he patched himself, into a room where Prima is waiting with a small fire and a thin meal, and a daughter who does not yet know to be afraid of any of this. He does not tell Prima everything Vibius said. He tells her only that the water stain is worse, that they should keep the path to the stairs clear at all times, day and night, nothing stacked in front of the door, nothing that might slow even a few heartbeats a family trying to move quickly in the dark. She does not ask why. She's already begun doing this herself these past weeks, without either of them ever discussing it as a decision. That is its own kind of answer. Let that quiet, wordless preparation sit with you now. 2 people who love each other, rearranging their small life around a danger neither of them will name aloud, because naming it changes nothing, except how loudly the fear speaks in the silence afterward. Spring comes late that year. The rains finally break in somewhere in the 2nd month, and with the warmer weather comes a different kind of pressure on the building. Not water this time, but people. Word has spread through every insula in Rome, through every tavern and bathhouse and street corner, that the Emperor Trajan intends to celebrate his triumph over the Dacians with games on a scale the city has never seen, gladiatorial combats and beast hunts stretching across 123 days, thousands of gladiators, thousands of animals brought from every corner of the known world, the whole spectacle to be staged at the Flavian Amphitheatre and across the Circus Maximus, free to any citizen who can find a place to stand or sit and watch. 123 days of games means 123 days of visitors flooding into Rome from every province and provincial town within reach. Farmers and minor officials and veterans and merchants, all of them needing somewhere to sleep. None of them able to afford the respectable inns near the Forum. All of them, inevitably, funneling toward the Subura and districts like it, where a bed can be had cheap if you do not ask too many questions about how many other people are sharing the room with you. Marcus Oppius Sila, who has never climbed higher than the 2nd floor of his own building, sees in this flood of visitors exactly what he sees in everything: an opportunity for more rent from the same rooms he already owns. Word comes down through neighbour, delivered with the same flat lack of apology that accompanies every one of Sila's decisions, that tenants on every floor are permitted, encouraged, really, though the word used is permitted, as though it were a favour, to take in lodgers for the duration of the games, provided the master receives half of whatever additional rent is collected. It is not phrased as a demand, because it does not need to be. Everyone in the building understands that half of something is better, in Sellers' calculation, than all of nothing, and that a tenant who declines to cooperate might find his own rent quietly increased instead, for reasons that would never quite be explained. Gaius and Prima argue about it quietly, late one night after Marcella has fallen asleep, in the particular hushed voices 2 people use when they do not want a sleeping child or a thin wall to carry their disagreement any further than it has to travel. Prima is against it from the first word. Their room is 9 feet by 12, already crowded with 3 bodies and all their belongings, and the thought of a stranger sleeping in that same space, breathing that same air, is more than she is willing to accept even for the coin it would bring. Gaius, who has spent every day for 6 months watching how thin their savings jar remains no matter how carefully they husband it, argues the other side without much conviction, more because the coin genuinely matters than because he wants to win the argument. In the end they take no lodger, though Fusca across the landing does. A pair of brothers from a farming town outside Capua come to Rome to see the games and willing to sleep 4 to a room built for 2, paying Fusca enough in 120 days that she will not need to take in mending again until autumn. The whole floor grows louder in those weeks, more crowded on the stairs, more strain on every resource the building barely provides even in ordinary times. The water fountain queue 3 streets away doubling in length some mornings, the shared latrine pit at the base of the stairwell filling faster than it is emptied, the general hum of too many bodies packed into too little space rising by a full register, the way a pot of water rises toward a boil. Gaius notices, climbing the stairs one evening in the 3rd week of the games, that the 4th floor landing, the soft board he has stepped around for years, has begun to flex more noticeably underfoot, a slight give he can feel through the sole of his sandal that was not there even a month ago, and he understands, without needing Vibius to explain it, that more feet on these stairs, more weight moving up and down them dozens of extra times a day, as tenants ferry lodgers and their belongings and their meals up 6 flights, is wearing at timber already worn thin by years of the same abuse. The public excitement of the games themselves is impossible to ignore, even from 6 floors up in a tenement in the Subura, and one bright morning in the 2nd month of the spectacle, Gaius takes Marcella, now 4 years old, sturdy on her legs, endlessly curious, to stand in the crowd near the Flavian amphitheatre on a day when the games are free to all, and half the city seems to have turned out simply to be near the noise of it, even those who cannot afford or cannot secure a seat inside. They do not go in. A citizen's ticket, when one can be got at all through connections Gaius does not have, still requires standing in a queue since dawn that a working man cannot afford to join and still make his wage that day. But they stand outside among the crowd, in the shadow of that vast curved wall of travertine stone rising higher than any insula in Rome. 4 stories of arches stacked upon arches, gleaming pale gold in the morning sun, built by the Emperor Vespasian a generation ago on ground that had once been the private lake of a tyrant's palace, given back, as the story goes, to the people of Rome. Gaius stands with his daughter's small hand in his and looks up at that wall, genuinely marvelling despite himself, because even a tired labourer who has spent years learning to distrust every builder's promise cannot help but marvel at stone cut and fitted with the precision his own daily work will never touch, and feels the strange double weight of the moment. Pride, of a kind that this is his city, his emperor, his empire that raised such a thing, and beneath that pride a colder recognition that the amphitheatre's own arches are built to stand for centuries, engineered by men answerable to an emperor's name and an emperor's purse, while 6 floors of his own home rest on timber a corrupt landlord bought at the cheapest price a lumber merchant would sell for. The crowd roars from somewhere within the great bowl of the amphitheatre, a sound so large it seems to come from the stone itself rather than from the tens of thousands of throats producing it, and Marcella claps her small hands over her ears and laughs, delighted rather than frightened, the way small children can be delighted by things that would frighten anyone old enough to understand what produces them. Gaius picks her up onto his shoulders so she can see over the crowd, though there is nothing to see from out here except the great curved wall and the awning ropes strung along its top edge. The vast canvas sails that can be drawn across the whole open bowl to shade the audience from the sun, engineered by sailors from the imperial fleet specially stationed in Rome for exactly that purpose. "Higher than our house," Marcella says, craning her neck up at the amphitheatre's rim, and Gaius laughs despite himself, a short, surprised sound, because she is not wrong. The amphitheatre stands perhaps 160 feet at its highest point, more than double the 60-foot limit the law sets for an insula, but built of solid stone and concrete and iron cramps, engineered to bear the trampling weight of 50,000 spectators without so much as a tremor, while his own home, barely a third that height, groans and shifts under the weight of a handful of families and their braziers and their water jars. Higher and steadier, Gaius says, mostly to himself, and does not explain the second half of that thought to a 4-year-old who only wants to watch the pigeons wheeling above the awning ropes. That night, back in their own building, climbing past Fusca's lodgers, snoring 3 to a mat in a room meant for 2, Gaius carries Marcella up the last 2 flights because her legs have finally given out after the long day, and at the top of the stairs, instead of going straight into their own room, he pauses at the small door that leads out onto the flat section of roof above the 6th floor, an area the tenants use, when weather permits, to dry washing or simply to escape the packed air below for a few minutes of open sky. He climbs the last short ladder with Marcella's arms round his neck and steps out onto planking that groans faintly under their combined weight, and the whole city opens up around him the way it does on the rare evenings he makes this small climb. Rooftops in every direction, red tile and grey tile, and the flatter roofs of tenements like his own, a jumbled sea of them stretching toward every horizon, smoke rising in thin grey threads from 1,000 cooking fires, the distant gilded roofs of the temples on the Capitoline catching the last of the sun, and far below, impossibly far below, given how short the actual distance is, the sound of the whole city's evening noise rising up to meet him, shouts, cartwheels, a snatch of music from some tavern, a baby crying somewhere close and somewhere else, entirely unrelated, another baby answering it. From up here he can see, past the crowded rooftops of the Subura, the gardens of a wealthy domus 2 streets distant, a rare green square amid the packed brick and tile, cypress trees standing dark and straight above a wall too high for Gaius to see over even from this height, and beyond that further still, the pale marble roofline of a temple, and beyond that the hills themselves, the Palatine crowned with the sprawling imperial palace, larger than this entire tenement block many times over, home to 1 family and their household, while 6 families are pressed into a single floor of the building on which Gaius now stands. He has stood up here before, more times than he could count, and every time the view produces in him the same twinned feeling, something that might, in a kinder world, be called wonder at the sheer scale and grandeur of the city he lives inside, and beneath the wonder, always, the low understanding that the grandeur was never built for him, that he lives in the seams between the marble, in the gaps the marble does not bother to fill, 6 stories up on timber that groans. Marcella, half asleep against his shoulder, murmurs something about pigeons, and Gaius holds her a moment longer in the open air before the evening chill drives them both back down through the small door, back into the stairwells close, smoky dark, back down toward their room where Prima is waiting with the last of the day's bread, and a question in her eyes about how the games had looked from outside the walls that neither of them, tonight, particularly wants to answer honestly. Let that view stay with you, the whole gleaming gilded marble-crowned city spread out below, and the small splintering platform of home from which Gaius looked at it. That contrast is the whole of his world, and it is about to matter more than he knows. The games continue for weeks more, the city's rhythm bent entirely around them, and slowly the extra lodgers begin to thin out of buildings across the Subura as visitors from the provinces finish their business in Rome and start the long journeys home. Wagons and mule trains threading back out along the roads in the opposite direction from which they came. Fusca's brothers leave in the 9th week, leaving her with a small hoard of coin and a floor that creaks. She confides to Prima one afternoon over the low wall of the drying terrace. In places it never used to creak before they arrived. Gaius has noticed the same thing about the stairs and about the 4th floor landing, and about a new sound that has joined the building's nighttime vocabulary sometime in the last month. Not the dry tick he has grown almost used to, but something lower, a groan that seems to come from deep within the frame itself rather than from any single visible timber. A sound he feels sometimes as much as hears, a faint vibration through the soles of his feet when he stands still on the 6th floor landing at the wrong moment. He raises this with Vibius again, and this time the old mason does not offer even the small comfort of a shrug. He asks Gaius to describe exactly where the sound seems to originate, how often it comes, whether it has changed in character over the recent weeks, and when Gaius finishes describing it as best he can, Vibius sets down the trowel he's been holding and is quiet for longer than is comfortable. "That is not settling," Vibius says finally. Settling is the sound a building makes once when it is young and finds its final shape, and then it stops making that sound because it has found its shape and it does not need to find it again. A building that groans like that after 15-20 years standing is not settling anymore. It is failing, slowly, but it is failing. He looks at Gaius with an expression that carries no comfort in it at all, only a hard, weary honesty that Gaius will remember for the rest of his life. "I would get your family out of that building if I were you, boy. I mean that as plainly as I have ever meant anything." "And go where?" Gaius says, and it is not really a question, because both men already know there is no answer to it that either of them can afford. Vibius has no answer either. He only nods, once, slowly. The nod of a man who has given the only warning he's able to give and knows it will not be enough to change what happens next, because it was never in his power to change it, only to see it coming. The way an old sailor sees weather building on a horizon he has no way of steering around. That night Gaius does not sleep. He lies on his mat with Prima breathing slow, and even beside him, and Marcella curled against her other side, and he listens to the building the way he has never quite let himself listen before, fully, without the comfortable lie of settling wood to hide behind any more, and in the deep hours past midnight he hears it again, that low groan, longer this time, seeming to travel through the frame from somewhere above, somewhere near the illegal 7th floor where the glass worker's furnace still burns some nights past the hour. Any sensible person would keep a fire lit in a building made of kindling. He does not wake Prima. There's nothing to do at this hour that would not simply frighten her without giving her anywhere safer to go, and so instead he lies still, eyes open in the dark, and does the only thing left within his power. He memorizes, one more time, exactly where the door is, exactly how many steps it takes to cross the room in the dark, exactly which way the stairs turn on the landing outside, so that if the night ever comes when counting those steps correctly is the only thing standing between his family and the building's true intentions, he will not need light to find his way, only memory and instinct, and however much time the wooded willing to give him before it finally, after all these years of groaning warnings, decides to keep its oldest promise. Let that sleepless night sit with you now, The way it sits with Gaius, a man lying still in the dark, listening to a building breathe its last slow breaths, and understanding for the first time with total clarity that a decision is coming that will not wait for him to be ready for it. Summer settles over Rome thick and heavy, the kind of heat that presses down on the Subura's narrow streets and refuses to lift even after sundown, when the packed brick and stone of 1,000 buildings release the day's stored warmth back into air, already too still to carry it away. On market days, the crowding is worst of all, and the first day of the month is always a market day of particular size, when the great food markets near the Forum draw crowds from every district of the city, and the smaller neighbourhood markets that ring the Subura fill with vendors hawking bread, oil, fish sauce, cheap wine, cast-off clothing, anything that can be sold for a coin to a population that has almost none to spare. Gaius goes to market that morning with Prima and Marcella, as they do most months, less to buy, their coin stretches to little enough, than because the alternative is staying in the building, and on a hot morning with the whole district's braziers already lit for the day's cooking, staying in the building has come to feel these last weeks, like its own kind of quiet dread neither of them names aloud. The market itself is a crush of bodies, stalls packed close along both sides of a street barely wide enough for 2 loaded handcarts to pass, the air thick with the smell of fish left too long in the heat, of bread baking in a dozen ovens at once, of unwashed bodies pressed shoulder to shoulder in a heat that shows no mercy to anyone. Marcella clings to Gaius's hand as the crowd surges past a fishmonger's stall, where a dispute has broken out, a customer accusing the seller of weighting his scales, voices rising, a small shoving match that draws a ring of onlookers eager for the spectacle of someone else's argument, and Gaius lifts her onto his shoulders the way he did outside the amphitheatre, both to keep her safe from the crush of legs and elbows and to give her some small joy amid an otherwise exhausting, overheated errand. From up there she can see over the stalls, and she points and exclaims at things with the delight only a child brings to an ordinary market day, and for a few minutes Gaius allows himself to simply be a father carrying his daughter through a crowd, nothing more. No thought of cracks or groaning timber, only the immediate, uncomplicated pleasure of her small hands gripping his hair and her laughter somewhere above his head. It does not last. On the walk home, cutting back through the Subura's narrower alleys with a small basket of what little they bought, a twist of coarse bread, a handful of onions, a small jar of cheap oil, they pass a building 2 streets from their own, where a crowd has gathered in the street, looking up, and Gaius feels the old cold drop in his stomach before he has even seen what they are looking at. It is not fire this time. It is a crack, visible from the street, running diagonally across the face of the building's 4th and 5th floors, wide enough to see from the ground, wide enough that a city official, an aedil's assistant by the look of his dress, though not the aedile himself, who would never trouble to walk the Subura's alleys personally, has been summoned and stands now at the base of the building with a wax tablet, taking notes with an air of profound reluctance, as though the entire errand offends his sense of how his morning ought to have gone. They're saying it's been like that for a month, a woman near Gaius says to no one in particular, the way people narrate disasters to strangers when the scale of the thing demands to be shared. Landlord wouldn't fix it. Tenants complained to the aedile's office finally, and look how fast that got anyone out here. Her tone makes clear exactly how fast that was, and exactly how little she expects to come of it. The assistant finishes his notes, exchanges a few words with a man Gaius takes to be the building's owner or his agent, well-dressed, calm, entirely unbothered. The posture of a man who has had this exact conversation with officials before and knows precisely how it ends, and then folds his tablet and departs without ordering so much as a single tenant evacuated, without so much as a rope strung across the alley, to warn passers-by away from what stands by any plain reading of the crack running across its face. One hard rain or one strong gust of wind away from shedding brick onto the street below. Gaius watches this whole small drama play out and feels something harden in him that has been softening into resignation for months. He has asked Naba for a real repair and been refused. He has patched a crack with his own coin and his own hands because no one else would. He has listened to Vibius, a man who has spent 30 years watching buildings like this one fail, tell him plainly to move his family out, and he has not moved them, because there is nowhere to move them to that does not cost more than he has. And now he watches a needle's own assistant look directly at a crack that half the street can see is dangerous, exchange pleasantries with the man responsible for it, and walk away having changed nothing at all. They won't do anything until it falls, Gaius says to Prima, quiet, as they walk on past the gathered crowd. Marcella still perched on his shoulders, blessedly too young to understand the weight of what the adults around her are discussing. Not this one, not ours, not any of them. They'll write it down and they'll walk away and they'll wait for it to fall, and then they'll write down how many died, and that's the only inspection this city actually performs. Prima does not answer immediately. When she does, her voice is low and steadier than Gaius expects. Then we don't wait for them to decide anything. We decide first. She looks at him directly. I want us sleeping with our sandals on from now on. I want the door bar easy to lift, not wedged. I want nothing stacked against it. Ever. Not even for a night. I want Marcella's mat by the door, not by the wall. A pause. I should have asked for this months ago. Gaius does not argue. There is nothing in what she has said that he has not already been thinking himself, alone, in the dark, counting his own steps to the door. They walk the rest of the way home in a silence that is not quite peace and not quite fear, but something adjacent to both. The silence of two people who have finally stopped pretending, even to each other, that ordinary caution will be enough. That evening, back on the 6th floor, Gaius rearranges the room by lamplight while Prima cooks the last of the market bread over the brazier, and Marcella watches with wide eyes as her sleeping mat is dragged from its familiar place against the wall with the patched crack, to a new place nearer the door, a smaller, less comfortable spot, but one that Gaius can reach in 2 strides with his eyes shut, one that puts her body between her parents and the fastest way out rather than pressed against timber and mud brick that has been failing, slowly, for longer than she has been alive. "Why are we moving?" Marcella asks, in the direct way of small children who have not yet learned that some questions make adults uncomfortable. "Because I want you closer to me," Gaius says, which is true, if not the whole truth, and she accepts it the way children accept most things adults tell them, without needing the deeper layer explained, and goes back to turning over her wooden horse in her small hands, tracing its carved mane with one finger, entirely unaware that 6 feet away her father's just quietly reorganized the whole of their small world around the shape of an escape. He prays every night now he will never actually need to make. Let that new arrangement of the room sit with you. A family rebuilding their most intimate space not around comfort, not around convenience, but around survival, because they have finally understood all three of them in their own ways that no one else is coming to keep this building standing for them. In the days after that rearrangement, Gaius finds himself doing something he has never done before in 4 years of living in this building. He begins quietly, without ever quite naming the project to Prima, to learn the habits of every family on his floor and the floor below, not out of neighbourliness exactly, though it looks like neighbourliness from the outside, but because a man who's decided his family's survival may one day depend on speed down a single crowded stairwell wants to know in advance whose door tends to stick, whose children are slow risers, who keeps a hallway blocked with jars or baskets that might cost precious seconds in the dark. He learns that Fusca, despite her age, moves quickly and calmly under pressure. He has seen this already, the night of the fire 2 streets over, when she was among the first to knock on doors and rouse sleeping neighbours before the vigil's horn had even sounded. He learns that the family 2 doors down, a fuller and his wife who work the stinking back-breaking trade of laundering wool in vats of stale urine down near the river, keep an infant in a wicker basket that hangs from a hook by their door, ready to be snatched up in one motion rather than gathered from a floor mat. A small precaution Gaius admires and privately wishes he had thought of himself when Marcella was smaller. He learns, too, exactly how long it takes, counted under his breath on an ordinary evening with no danger present at all, to descend from the 6th floor to the street at an unhurried walk, a slow count of 200 give or take, weaving past the worst of the stairwell's known hazards, and he tries once, on a quiet night, when Prima is already asleep and does not see him do it, to descend the same stairs at something closer to the pace panic might demand, testing his own knees against the shallow, uneven treads in near darkness with only a single small oil lamp cupped in one hand, and finds that even at speed, even alone, the descent still takes longer than he is comfortable admitting to himself, longer than a fire climbing through timber lattice would likely wait for him. This private, obsessive rehearsal does not save the family in the end through any single dramatic use of a fact learned in it. No piece of information he gathers about a neighbour's habits or a stairwell's exact hazards directly determines the outcome of the night still to come. But it does something else, something Gaius only recognises much later, in the calm of the new room on the 5th floor of a better-built building. It keeps him from freezing on the night it finally matters, in that first terrible half-second when the smell of scorched wool reaches him on the stairs, before his mind has consciously understood what it is smelling. His body already knows the path. His legs have already rehearsed the 200 count. He does not have to think in order to move, because he has already spent weeks teaching himself not to need to. Let that quiet, unglamorous discipline sit with you for a moment. Not heroism, not any dramatic gesture, only the patient, private work of a frightened man preparing, again and again, for a night he hopes with his whole heart will never actually arrive. 2 more weeks pass in that new arrangement, weeks that feel to Gaius both entirely ordinary and unbearably tense at once. The 2 states somehow coexisting the way they do for anyone who has learned to live inside a long emergency, going about the daily business of work and food and small family joys, while some other part of the mind never stops listening, never stops counting cracks, never stops rehearsing the 2 strides to the door. The heat of high summer breaks finally in the 3rd week, and the first proper rain in nearly a month falls over Rome on an evening when Gaius comes home later than usual, held up at the work site by a delivery of timber that arrived badly cut and had to be resorted before the crew could leave for the day. He climbs the 6 flights in the rain-fresh dark. the stairwell smelling of wet stone and wet timber, and faintly of the wood smoke that never fully leaves the air even on the wettest nights. And he notices on the 4th floor landing that the soft board he has stepped around for 2 years now has a visible depression in it, a shallow bowl worn or sagged into the wood that was not there even a month before, deep enough that his sandal sinks slightly into it before finding the firmer wood beneath. He mentions this to no one that night except Prima, in the hushed voice they now use for anything concerning the building, and she listens without alarm, because alarm has become, by this point, simply the background hum of their days, a note so constant it no longer produces the sharp spike of fear it once did. Only a steady, low-grade dread that colours everything, the way a persistent headache colours a whole day without ever quite becoming the only thing a person can think about. 4 days later, on an evening that begins like every other evening that summer, the smell reaches Gaius on the stairs before anything else does, the way smell always arrives first. But it is wrong in a way he registers half a flight before his mind catches up to name it. Not the ordinary wood smoke of 100 braziers, something sharper, something with an edge of scorched wool or scorched hair in it, acrid, immediate, the smell that does not belong to ordinary cooking, the smell every tenant in every insula in Rome has been trained by hard experience to recognize instantly and to fear more than almost anything else in the world. He takes the last 2 flights at a run. The sound reaches him before he clears the 5th floor, not yet a roar, not yet the full-throated hunger he remembers from the fire 2 streets over the previous autumn, but a crackling, spitting sound, close, too close, coming from somewhere just above him, from the direction of the 7th floor, from the direction of the glassworker's furnace that has burned too many nights too late for too many months for this moment not to have been, in some sense, inevitable. From the day that furnace was first lit inside a building made of timber lattice and dried mud, he bursts onto the 6th floor landing and the smoke is already here, curling down the stairwell from above in a thin grey ribbon that thickens even as he watches it. And somewhere above him a voice is shouting, high and panicked, a woman's voice, and another voice answering it. And the crackling sound is louder now, undeniably fire, undeniably close, undeniably above the very rooms where his wife and daughter are sitting right now, tonight, on the wrong side of a groaning, water-softened, overloaded floor that Vibius told him months ago was failing. Gaius does not remember crossing his own threshold. He remembers, afterward, only fragments. The door under his hand, the bar already lifted because Prima keeps it that way now. Always, every evening since the market day crack. Prima's face turning toward him, already alarmed because she has smelled the smoke too, because smell always arrives first, and Marcella scrambling up from her mat by the door, already reaching for him, already frightened by the change in her father's face before he has said a single word. Fire, Gaius says, 1 word. No time for more, and it is enough. Prima is already moving, scooping up Marcella with one arm and reaching for the water jar they have kept filled by the door for exactly this reason. The whole rehearsed shape of the last several months compressing into a handful of seconds that neither of them has to think through, because their bodies have already been drilled in this exact motion, night after night, in silence, without either of them ever admitting aloud that this was what they were practicing for. Out on the landing the smoke is thicker now, and above them, through the stairwell shaft, Gaius can see a flickering orange light pulsing against the underside of the 7th floor, and the shouting up there has taken on a different, worse quality, less alarm now than pain, and he understands, in the fraction of a second his mind allows itself to understand it, that someone up there is already past the point of simply running. There is no time to help them. This thought arrives in Gaius with a violence that will return to him in dreams for years afterward. The flat, brutal calculation that a man makes in the space of a single held breath, that the stairs above him are already burning or about to burn, that going up would mean not saving anyone but adding a third body to whatever the fire has already claimed, that the only choice that saves his own family is down, now, immediately, without hesitation, without looking back up that stairwell shaft one single time longer than the half second it takes to understand there is nothing to be done from where he stands. Down, he says to Prima, and they go. The fourth floor landing takes his weight wrong. He feels it the instant his foot lands on the soft board. The depression that was a shallow bowl 4 days ago has become something else entirely. The wood beneath his sandal flexing far past where flexing should stop. And for one lurching, sickening half second, the whole landing seems to drop an inch beneath him before somehow, impossibly, catching itself. The timber groaning a sound Gaius has heard before only in the deep hours of the night, now happening in daylight, in real time, under his own actual weight, with his wife and daughter 3 steps behind him. "Don't stop on this board," he shouts back to Prima, already moving past it, already 3 steps down toward the 3rd floor, and behind him he hears Prima's own foot land. Hears the same groan, shorter this time, and does not look back to see whether the landing holds a second time, because looking back costs half a second he does not have to spare. Other tenants are pouring out of doors on every floor now, the whole building's population converging on the single narrow stairwell at once. The stairs jammed with bodies moving in every direction, some rushing down toward the street, some, absurdly, unbelievably, trying to push up past the flow to reach belongings or family members on higher floors, creating brief, dangerous eddies of shoving and shouting in a space barely wide enough for 2 people to pass even in calm conditions. Gaius keeps one hand locked around Marcella's small wrist, where Prima has passed her to him for the descent, his other hand on the wall for balance, moving as fast as the press of bodies allows, the smoke thickening behind them with every flight they descend, the orange light above growing when he risks one glance upward through the stairwell shaft, brighter and wider than it was even a minute ago. Somewhere behind and above him, on the stairs he has just descended, he hears a sound that is unlike anything the building has made before. Not a groan, not a crack, but a deep, tearing crash, wood giving way all at once rather than slowly, and a scream that cuts off with a suddenness that Gaius will remember for the rest of his life, and never once described to Marcella, not when she is 4, not when she is 40, because there are some sounds a father decides, on the spot, in the moment of hearing them, that his child will simply never need to carry. He does not know in that moment whether the sound was the 4th floor landing finally giving way entirely behind the last of the fleeing tenants, or something higher, the 7th floor beginning its collapse into the 6th, the 6th into the 5th, the slow-motion pancake failure that Vibius warned him about materializing at last in real time, in the dark, with people still on the stairs. He does not stop to find out. He drags Marcella down the last 2 flights with a strength he does not remember summoning, Prima's hand gripping the back of his tunic to keep from being separated in the crush, and they burst out through the ground floor archway, past the 2 carved stone doves that gave the building its falsely gentle name, into the street, into the cool night air, into a crowd already gathering, already shouting, already pointing upward at smoke and flame, now clearly visible against the dark sky above the roofline. Gaius does not stop moving until he is 30 feet from the building's face, out past the range where falling brick or timber could reach him, and only then does he turn, Marcella clutched against his chest, Prima's hand still fisted in his tunic, and look back up at the insula of the two doves in the full horror of what is happening to it. The 7th floor is fully alight now, flame visible through what used to be windows, a bright, hungry orange against the black sky, and even as he watches, a section of the roofline above the 7th floor sags, tips and folds inward, with a crash that sends a fountain of sparks up into the dark, and a groan from the crowd around him that is half horror and half the low, helpless recognition of people who have seen this exact thing happen before, and will, unless something changes, see it happen again. The vigils arrive within minutes, faster this time than the fire 2 streets over last autumn, because this station is closer, because someone ran for them the instant the smoke was smelled from the street, hauling their water pump on its cart, their leather buckets, their long-hook poles for tearing down burning timber before the flame can leap the gap to the next building, and they set to work with the grim, practiced efficiency of men who do this several times a season, forming a bucket chain from the nearest public fountain, soaking blankets in vinegar to beat at the flames licking along the 6th floor windows, focusing their efforts less on saving the building itself, which even Gaius, in the first shock of the moment, can see is already beyond saving, and more on keeping the fire from leaping to the buildings on either side, where hundreds more families sleep in structures built exactly the same way, of exactly the same materials by exactly the same class of landlord. Gaius stands in the crowd with his family and watches his home burn, and somewhere in the swelling noise of the crowd he hears names being called, people counting who made it out and who did not, and he hears with a lurch of nausea Fusca's name called by someone and answered. She is here, she is safe, she got out on the arm of a neighbour. And he hears other names called and not answered, called again, called a 3rd time into a silence that grows heavier with each repetition, and he understands that the glassworker family on the 7th floor, the family whose furnace burned too many nights too late, the family whose fire this almost certainly was, however it started, will not be answering any name tonight or any night after. He learns later, in the days that follow, pieced together from what neighbours and vigils and the few survivors from the upper floors are willing to say, roughly how it happened. A coal from the glassworker's furnace, banked too shallow or too late in the night, caught a scrap of raw wool stored too near the fire pit for the coming winter's work. The flame found the timber lattice of the 7th floor's walls within minutes, the same opus craticium construction that Vitruvius condemned a century before as catching fire, he wrote, as if it had been made for the purpose. The fire, finding no resistance in unfired brick already softened by a summer's worth of leaking rain, ate through the floor separating the 7th story from the 6th, far faster than any timber should burn, and the added weight the 7th floor was never designed to bear finally found. In the fire's heat, the exact moment its overtaxed frame could no longer hold, and floor came down onto floor in a matter of minutes rather than the slow years of groaning that had preceded it. 9 people died that night. By the final count the vigil's officer gave to the small crowd of surviving tenants gathered in the street 2 days later, 5 of the 7 members of the glassworker family, an elderly man on the 6th floor who could not move fast enough on the stairs, and 2 more from the 5th floor caught in the collapse of the landing. Gaius himself had felt buckle beneath his own weight only moments before. 23 more were injured, some badly, burned or struck by falling timber, or trampled in the crush of the single overloaded stairwell that was the only way down for the whole building's population, a stairwell that a building of this height and this occupancy should never, by any honest standard of construction, have been allowed to rely upon alone. Let that number settle into you the way it settled into Gaius, standing in the street with his living wife and his living daughter in his arms, watching the last of the fire consume what had been, until an hour before, the whole of his family's world, 9 dead, 23 hurt, and a building that had been warning everyone who lived inside it for months in cracks and groans and softened brick, exactly what was coming, if only anyone with the power to stop it had been willing to listen. That first night, Gaius and his family sleep, along with a dozen other displaced tenants, in the open colonnade of a temple porch 2 streets away, on borrowed cloaks and bare stone. Marcella wedged between her parents' bodies for warmth, none of them sleeping more than in brief, exhausted snatches, all of them starting awake at every distant sound that might, in the disordered logic of shock, be mistaken for the crackle of new flame. Prima does not cry that night, not where Marcella can see, but Gaius feels her shaking beside him in the dark, silent, controlled, the particular grief of a woman who has just watched everything she owned, the cooking pots, the sleeping mats, the small carved wooden horse Marcella left behind in the scramble down the stairs, every scrap of cloth and clay and memory that made up their small life, reduced to ash and rubble in less time than it takes to walk to the market and back. In the morning, the street in front of the insula of the 2 Doves looks like the aftermath of a siege. What remains of the building stands roofless and gutted above the 3rd floor, black timber jutting at broken angles against the pale morning sky, the 2 carved stone doves above the archway somehow untouched by the flames that consumed everything around them, an absurd, almost cruel little detail that several of the gathered tenants remark on, with the bitter half-laughter of people who have run out of any better response. The ground floor shops, protected as always by their sturdier stone and their distance from the worst of the blaze, have already reopened for business, the baker sweeping ash from his threshold with brisk, business-like strokes, because bread must still be sold whatever has happened to the people who used to buy it from the floors above him. A crowd gathers through the morning, surviving tenants first, then neighbours from adjoining buildings, then simple onlookers drawn by the spectacle of disaster, the way onlookers are always drawn to disaster in a city as densely packed as Rome, where news of this kind travels from street to street within the hour, and pulls half a district out of its ordinary business to come and stare at what has happened to someone else. Among the crowd, eventually, arriving later than any decent sense of urgency should have allowed, comes Naba, seller's agent, picking his way through the wreckage-strewn street with an expression of profound personal inconvenience, as though the building's collapse were chiefly an irritation visited upon him, rather than a catastrophe visited upon the people who lived in it. Gaius watches him from across the street, Marcella asleep at last against Prima's shoulder, and feels something in himself go very still and very cold, the particular calm that sometimes arrives on the far side of a fear too large to keep feeling actively. He crosses the street before he has fully decided to do it. 9 dead, Gaius says. No greeting, no preamble, standing close enough that neighbour cannot easily step around him without the whole watching crowd noticing the evasion. The crack I showed you last autumn was in the wall directly under where that floor gave way. I told you it was a load-bearing timber. I told you twice. Neighbour's face does the thing Gaius has watched it do 100 times before, across 100 rent collections. A kind of practice smoothing, an expression assembled specifically for moments like this one, betraying nothing, conceding nothing. No one can say what caused a fire like this, he says. These things happen. It is a tragedy. The master will, of course, want to know that his tenants are safe. He does not ask in that sentence or any that follows whether Gaius's family is in fact safe, though Gaius is standing directly in front of him, soot still ground into the creases of his hands, his wife and sleeping daughter, visible not 20 feet away. "Where is he?" Gaius says. "Where is Sila? 9 people are dead and he isn't even here." "The master has business across the city today," neighbour says, in the tone of a man reciting something he has rehearsed on the walk over, and turns to go, and it's only the press of the crowd around them, other tenants drawn closer by the exchange, other voices rising now in support of Gaius's question, that stops him from simply walking away entirely. "He'll want to rebuild," someone in the crowd says, bitter, loud enough to carry. "Same ground, same corners cut, same rent by winter, you watch." Nabor does not answer that directly, though something in his silence confirms it more completely than any words could have. He extracts himself from the crowd within a few more minutes, retreating back the way he came, and the tenants left behind in the street. Homeless now, most of them, with nowhere immediate to go and no coin returned to them for the month's rent already paid on rooms that no longer exist, are left to do what poor Romans in this exact situation have always had to do: rely on each other, on distant relatives, on whatever charity a temple or a guild or a sympathetic neighbour can extend, because the law of the city, whatever it says on parchment about a landlord's obligations, has no mechanism at all for making a man like Solaire answer personally for what his negligence has cost. That mechanism does exist in theory. Roman law recognises that a building's owner bears responsibility when defective construction causes harm, and an aggrieved party can, in principle, bring an action before a magistrate to seek damages. But Gaius has already learned, in his years of watching how the world actually works rather than how the law describes it working, that theory and practice part ways precisely at the point where a poor man's word must be weighed against a wealthy freedman's coin, and that bringing such an action costs money for advocates and witnesses, and the endless patience such proceedings demand. Money that a man who has just lost every possession he owned to a fire simply does not have. Sila, for his part, understands this arithmetic as well as anyone in Rome, and has built his entire fortune on the confidence that it will hold. Word does travel, though, in the days that follow, in the way that word travels through a city like Rome regardless of what any official does or does not do about it. Through the baths, through the taverns, through the gossip of slaves running errands between households, through the market stalls where the collapse of the insula of the 2 doves becomes, for a week or two, the single subject every conversation eventually circles back toward. 9 dead is not, in itself, an unusual number for Rome to absorb in a season. The city has swallowed worse, far worse, more than once within living memory, and the great fire under Nero 40 years before had taken thousands, not merely 9. But the particulars of this collapse, the illegal 7th floor, the water damage a tenant himself had reported and been refused, the single, narrow stairwell that trapped half the dead where they stood, catch at something in the public mood that a purely accidental fire might not have, because they suggest to anyone paying attention that this was not simply misfortune. It was arithmetic. Someone had done the sums on how much a repair would cost against how much a repair would save in future rent, and had chosen deliberately to let 9 people find out the answer. And Edile does eventually come to inspect the ruins nearly 2 weeks after the fire, by which time the wreckage has already been picked over for salvageable timber and brick by scavengers from across the district, and by which time any evidence that might have supported an official finding of negligence has been substantially disturbed by exactly the kind of scavenging poverty makes inevitable in a city where nothing, not even the charred remains of a building where people died, goes to waste if it can still be sold or used. The Edile's report, when it's eventually filed, notes construction defects consistent with the collapse. The unauthorized additional story, timber undersized for its span, evidence of water damage in the surviving lower floors, but stops short of assigning personal culpability to Keller himself, whose advocates argue, with some success, that a landlord cannot reasonably be expected to inspect every tenant's private complaint personally, and that the true responsibility, if it lies anywhere, lies with whichever long-departed contractor built the 7th floor over a decade before, a man conveniently dead and conveniently unable to answer for anything. Sila pays in the end a fine that Gaius later hears quoted in the street at a figure that would not cover even a fraction of what 9 lives, by any honest measure, ought to be worth. And within the year, exactly as the bitter voice in the crowd predicted on the morning after the fire, he has cleared the site, sold the salvage rights to the same scavengers who picked it clean, and begun negotiating with a contractor to raise a new insula on the same foundation. 6 floors this time rather than 7. Because even Sila has learned from this single expensive lesson that 7 floors invite more scrutiny than they are worth. Though nothing in the new building's actual walls, Gaius will hear later from Vibius, who's offered work on the site and refuses it on principle for the first time in his career, promises to be built any more honestly than the last one was. There is, in the weeks after the fire, one moment of larger public reckoning that Gaius witnesses in person, standing at the edge of a crowd gathered near the grain distribution point close to the porticus minutia, where the free grain dole that sustains a significant portion of Rome's poor population is measured out each month to citizens holding the proper tokens. It is here, among the ordinary business of the dole, men and women queuing with sacks and baskets, officials calling names and measures, the whole grinding essential machinery of a city that has learned it must feed its poor directly, or risk them rioting for bread, that news arrives, carried by a runner from the direction of the Forum, that Emperor Trajan himself, informed of the collapse and of at least 2 other similar incidents that same season in other districts of the city, has ordered his urban prefect to reaffirm and strengthen the height restrictions on insulae, first set down by the divine Augustus and tightened after Nero's great fire, decreeing that no tenement within the city may rise above 60 feet, that existing buildings found to exceed this limit are to be inspected and, where necessary, reduced, and that henceforth contractors found responsible for construction defects causing loss of life may be compelled to bear the cost of restitution to the victims' families from their own property, rather than allowing the burden to fall solely upon a distant, unaccountable owner. The crowd's reaction to this news, relayed imperfectly from person to person, the way news always travels through a crowd too large for any single voice to reach, is a strange mixture Gaius has trouble sorting through even as he stands in the middle of it. A flicker of real hope, because an emperor's decree carries weight that a poor tenant's individual complaint never will, mixed inseparably with a weariness that comes from having heard variations of this same promise before, after other fires, after other collapses, promises that improve the letter of the law without ever quite managing to improve the number of aediles willing to climb 6 flights of stairs to enforce it, without changing the fundamental arithmetic that still makes cutting corners more profitable, in the short run, than building honestly. They said the same after the fire 2 years back, an old woman near Gaius says to a neighbour in the dole queue. Not bitter exactly, simply tired. The specific tiredness of someone who has survived long enough in this city to have heard every version of this promise more than once. New rules on parchment, same landlords, same tenants 6 floors up hoping the wood holds another year. Gaius does not join that conversation, but he carries her words with him afterward, because he recognises in them something true that he does not want to be true, that laws written after a disaster are, in some sense, always written for the disaster that has already happened, rather than the one still gathering, unnoticed, in some other building's overloaded 7th floor, some other landlord's unrepaired crack, some other tenant's patched wall, holding back a failure that has not yet found its moment. And yet something has changed, if only a little, if only for a while. In the months that follow, Gaius hears of at least 2 buildings in neighbouring districts actually inspected and reduced by a floor under the new decree's authority. Of one contractor genuinely compelled to pay restitution to a family whose son was crushed in a partial collapse blamed squarely on undersized joists. The contractor himself had specified against his own foreman's advice of a general, if temporary, wariness among landlords across the city about how visibly they cut their corners, at least for a season, at least until memory of the insula of the 2 doves fades, the way memory of every disaster eventually fades in a city large enough and busy enough to keep generating new ones to displace the old. Let that uneasy, incomplete justice sit with you the way it sits with Gaius. Not nothing, not everything. The small, grinding, imperfect machinery of a great empire trying, in its own halting way, to learn a lesson it has already been taught many times before and will, in all likelihood, need teaching again. For Gaius and Prima and Marcella, the immediate aftermath is simpler and harder than any question of imperial decree. They need a roof. It takes them the better part of a month, staying first with Prima's cousin in a room already crowded with that family's own children, then with a guild brother of Gaius's, who has connections to a landlord in a different quarter of the Subura, to find a new room, smaller than the last, on the 5th floor rather than the 6th, in a building older but, by Vibius's careful inspection on Gaius's behalf, more honestly built, its timbers thicker, its stairwell wider, its ground floor tenant a retired centurion who takes a personal, watchful interest in the maintenance of a building. He intends to grow old inside rather than simply extract rent from at the greatest possible distance. It cost more, this new room, 22 sestertii a month instead of 18, a difference that strains an already thin budget in ways Gaius and Prima feel in smaller portions at every meal for the rest of that year. But Gaius has learned, in the clearest and most permanent way a lesson can be learned, that the 4 sestertii of difference is not a luxury. It is the price of a landlord who at least sometimes climbs his own stairs, of walls that do not flex under a testing thumb, of a floor that does not sag beneath the ordinary weight of a family simply living inside it. Marcella, in the weeks and months after the fire, does not entirely stop flinching at the smell of wood smoke, though she is young enough, mercifully, that the sharpest edges of the memory begin to soften within a year, in the particular way a small child's memory softens almost everything, retaining the shape of fear without always retaining the specific event that caused it. She does ask sometimes, in the new room, why her father checks the door bar every night before sleep, why he has taught her, as a kind of game she does not fully understand the seriousness of, exactly how many steps it takes to cross from her sleeping mat to the door with her eyes closed. Gaius answers her each time with some version of the same half-truth he told her the night he first moved her mat in the old building. Because I want you close to me. Because I want you safe. Because your father has seen what happens to families who are not ready, and he does not intend for his own family to ever be counted among them again. Vibius retires from construction work not long after, his hands finally too stiff, and his knees too worn for the daily climbing and lifting the trade demands, and in his last months on the crew, he takes Gaius aside more than once to pass along, in the direct unsentimental way of an old man settling his accounts before he leaves a place for good, everything he has learned across 30 years about which shortcuts a building will forgive and which it will not. Which materials a desperate contractor reaches for first, and how to recognize them once they're hidden behind plaster. How to read the particular language of a groan, or a crack, or a sag. The way another man reads the sky before a storm. Gaius listens to all of it the way a man listens who has already paid, in the coin of 9 dead neighbours and a lost home, for the value of exactly this kind of knowledge. And he carries what Vibius teaches him forward into his own work for the rest of his career, though he will admit to no one, not even Prima, how often in later years he stands on some new scaffold, laying some new landlord's undersized joist exactly as instructed, and thinks of the 7th floor of the insula of the 2 doves, and says nothing, because a labourer who refuses every dishonest job in Rome is a labourer who does not eat, and the arithmetic that killed 9 of his neighbours is the same arithmetic that still, every day, decides whether his own daughter has bread on her table. This is the quiet, unglamorous truth beneath the whole disaster. The truth no imperial decree ever quite manages to touch. That the men who build Rome's tenements, and the men who live in them, are very often, in the end, the very same men, caught on both sides of an arrangement neither of them designed and neither of them has the power to refuse. Gaius built the insula that nearly killed his own family with his own 2 hands on other men's projects 100 times over, before and after the fire. Because that is the only work a man of his station can find in a city where every profitable shortcut belongs, ultimately, to someone else's ledger. Let that truth settle over you now, heavy and quiet, the way it settles over Gaius in the years that follow. Not a villain punished and a wrong made right, but something messier and more honest than that, the way most of history actually resolves itself, imperfectly, unevenly, with small improvements bought at an enormous and unequal price, paid almost entirely by people who never had any say in how the bill was written. Years pass, as years do, and Rome goes on being Rome, building and burning and collapsing and rebuilding, the same arithmetic recalculated in every generation, with different names attached to the same essential shape, because a city that houses the greatest concentration of poverty and wealth the ancient world has ever assembled within a single set of walls will always, in every age, find some version of this same bargain being struck between desperate tenants and indifferent landlords. Marcella grows up, marries a potter's son from a more solidly built quarter near the Aventine, and raises her own children in rooms Gaius inspects personally, every time, running his testing thumb along the plaster the way Vibius once taught him. checking for the particular give of wattle beneath the surface meant to hide it, a habit he will never entirely set down for the rest of his life, long after the smell of that night's smoke has faded from every garment he owned, and every memory has softened at its edges the way all memories eventually do. He never fully stops listening, on quiet nights, for a particular kind of silence just before a particular kind of sound. Some habits, once a building has taught them to you thoroughly enough, do not leave. They simply become the shape a life learns to live inside. Let the weight of that whole long year settle now, the way it settled into Gaius across every season of it. The hauling, the patching, the counting of cracks, the smell of smoke arriving before anything else ever does, the 9 names called into a silence that never answered. You've carried this story a long way now, up 6 flights and down again, through spring games and summer fire, and it is almost time to let it rest. Think for a moment of everything that stood between Gaius and a safe night's sleep. A building thrown up in 4 months instead of 4 years, because speed meant profit and profit meant everything. Walls of timber lattice and unfired mudbrick, chosen because they were cheap, condemned by a careful architect 100 years before anyone bothered to read what he had written. A 7th floor that was never supposed to exist, added without permit, without inspection, without a single thought spared for the people who would one day sleep beneath it. A landlord who never climbed higher than the 2nd flight of his own stairs, who heard a tenant's warning and chose a fine over a repair over and over until the choice was finally made for him by fire. A law on parchment, written by an emperor with the best of intentions, that could not climb 6 flights of stairs on its own to enforce itself. None of that has fully left the world you live in now, though it wears different names in different centuries. Centuries will pass, and buildings will still be raised too fast by men who will never sleep inside them. Centuries will pass, and the cheapest materials will still find their way into the walls, where the poorest people rest their heads, while the strongest stone still rises for those who need it least. Centuries will pass, and a landlord somewhere will still hear a tenant's warning about a crack, a leak, a groaning floor, and choose, quietly, to do nothing, and hope the year passes without a reckoning. Some things don't change, they only change their clothing. But something else is also true, something worth holding on to as your own eyes grow heavy tonight. You're not sleeping on a 6th floor of green timber and dried mud, with a single narrow stairwell between you and a fire that has already found the wall above your head. Whatever this night holds for you, it very likely does not hold that. Somewhere between Gaius's Rome and your own quiet room, building codes were written and, however imperfectly, enforced. Materials were tested. Height limits were set with real teeth behind them. Fire brigades were trained and funded and made fast enough to matter. None of it arrived quickly, and none of it arrived evenly, and none of it arrived without exactly the kind of loss that took 9 of Gaius's neighbours in a single terrible hour. But it arrived. You are its inheritor, whether you have ever once thought of it that way before tonight. So let the weight of Rome settle, and let it go. Let the stairs fade, 6 flights of them, narrowing as they rise, the wood worn smooth by 2,000 years of feet that are no longer walking anywhere at all. Let the smoke fade, that first sharp note of wood smoke and damp mud brick and packed bodies that met Gaius every night at his own threshold. Let the crack in the plaster fade, the one he pressed his thumb into 100 times, measuring, hoping, lying to himself the way we all sometimes have to lie to ourselves just to get through another ordinary evening. Let the sound fade, that low groan in the dark, the one that was never really the wood settling, the one that was always quietly a warning. Let the water jar fade from your shoulder, the ache of it, the weight of every trip up every flight, because tonight there is no water to carry, no stairs to climb, only the soft, uncomplicated weight of your own blanket settling around you exactly where you already are. Let the games end, the crowds go home, the amphitheatre empty out under a darkening sky. Let the marketplace close for the night, the fish sold or thrown out, the crowd dispersed into 1,000 separate homes. Let the aedile's assistant fold his wax tablet one last time and walk away into a street that has gone quiet at last. Let the fire, wherever it still burns in your mind's eye, burn itself down to embers, and let the embers cool, and let the ash settle, grey and harmless, over a story that has already finished happening a long, long time ago. Let Gaius rest too, if he can. Let him set down at last the habit of listening for a silence just before a sound. Let him believe, just for tonight, in the room that Vibius helped him choose, with its thicker timbers and its wider stairwell, and its landlord who climbs his own stairs. Let him believe, at least for tonight, that the walls around his sleeping family will hold, because most nights, in the end, most walls do hold, even the imperfect ones, even the ones built by desperate men in a hurry, because collapse is the exception written large across history, precisely because survival was always the ordinary unremarked rule underneath it. Let your own walls hold too. Let the ceiling above you be exactly what it appears to be, solid, tested, uneventful, holding no 7th floor of illegal timber above your head, no furnace burning too late into the night, no crack widening in the dark that no one has been paid to repair. Let the quiet of your own room be simply quiet, and nothing more than that. Let sleep come now, the way it eventually came even to Gaius, even after everything, because a body can only stay vigilant for so many nights before it finally has to trust the walls around it, and because trust, however hard won, however imperfect, is still the only way any of us ever manage to close our eyes at the end of a long day and let go. Let the story fade, let the stairs fade, let the smoke fade, and the crack, and the sound in the dark. Let it all settle into the quiet, ordinary safety of wherever you are lying right now, in a building that was built to hold you, under a roof that was built to keep the weather out, and nothing more troubling than that. Centuries will pass, and people will still climb tired up long flights of stairs at the end of a long day. Centuries will pass, and people will still lie down close to the ones they love, listening just for a moment to the small sounds of the place that shelters them. Some things don't change. Let that be a comfort tonight, rather than a warning. You've already heard the warning. Now let it rest. Sleep well. Let the walls hold. Let the night be simply night. Good night.